as you can see from my dad's sweater, or Mr. Rogers' sweater, and some of our lumberjacks here in the audience, Merry Christmas! And all of this, right? Hopefully I'm the first one to tell you that so far. I'll tell you every week until Christmas, then I'll tell you then too. For us, celebrating the season of Advent has begun. That's a Latin word which means coming to. So, Advent makes much of the moment when God came to us in the Lord Jesus, the incarnation, and it anticipates, its great expectation, the second Advent when Jesus will come again. So, all these songs, all these themes are like multi-directional. We look back and it points us forward as well. And for our time, these 4 weeks, we're going to spend in Advent. We're going to spend it in the 4-chapter small book of Ruth. It's one of those that if you're flipping through quickly, you may not get to. It is right before the Samuels, just so you know. It's right before 1 Samuel. So go ahead and turn there. We'll be covering chapter 1 today. While you get there, let me just say, I love the book of Ruth. Amen. It is fitting for us to go through it, especially during the Advent season, because Ruth shows us how God, in this book, through this family, and the people that we're going to meet here, how he paves the road, the long road, the rough road that leads to the Messiah. Ruth is a story of comings and goings, of choices made, not all of them wise, of roads traveled. It's a story of deep suffering and despair, yet it's a story of great hope and comfort as well. The pun is fully intended when I say if you know what's going to happen in the book of Ruth in a few chapters, there is so much for us to glean here. Okay, well, moving on. Let's go to chapter 1. Woo! The first heading, see it, leaving home, verse 1 to 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Verse 1 tells us so much about what's going on when we hear the phrase, in the days when the judges ruled. This is not just a timestamp. It's not just given to us to let us know the setting in which the events in this story take place. This is a theological description of the nature of this time and age and place in which these events took place. So this is the period of the Judges, from which we get the book of Judges. Very good. Roughly, this is the time between Joshua and the prophet Samuel. So all that time in here, that's the period of the Judges when those events happened. This is also when Ruth happened as well. And this phrase happens a lot in the book of Judges. Judges 21:25 summarizes this day and age when it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So rather than everyone doing what was right in God's eyes, everyone's just doing whatever they want to do. There's no king. And so they feel free to act as they deem wise. This was a dark day in Israel's history. One of the darkest, I would say, in the history of Israel. And this is when Ruth happens. This alone kind of ought to be point number one today for us. This is a very difficult, despairing, full of suffering, darkness, and death time in Israel's history. And yet that this book happens in the midst of that time tells us there is not a time dark enough that would prohibit God from working. Even in the darkest of moments, the Lord is still active in a billion ways, and we might be aware of like a half of one. He's still working, and we'll see that throughout this book. Well, in these first 5 verses, we meet a family. Elimelech is the dad, Naomi the mom, and the 2 boys, the 2 sons, are Mahlon and Chilion. They lived in Bethlehem. But interestingly enough, did you note the detail? There's a famine going on in Bethlehem. We'll talk about perhaps why that's the case. But because of this famine, Elimelech makes a choice, right? This is a story of choices made. He makes a choice to leave Bethlehem and go into the country of Moab. And when he goes in, Elimelech dies. We're not sure how much time is there. It just says he went there, he died. His sons, Mahlon and Chilion, took Moabite wives, and after a period of time, they died, which leaves Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to fend for themselves, which in that time she was not allowed to, was not culturally appropriate to go out and get a job on her own to provide an income for herself and her daughters-in-laws. No, she had no husband to take care of her. There is therefore no income. So she is now in 5 verses from a full family to hungry, homeless, and widowed. This is a very dark time for this family. To make matters more interesting, Bethlehem, where they came from, means, I wonder if some of you know it, it means house of bread. But there's a famine in the house of bread, which means the house of bread has no bread. It's ironic that this would happen. Moab is only 50 miles away from Bethlehem, which also ought to raise some curiosities, because usually in a famine, you can't get to food 50 miles away from you. It's widespread event. Usually famines are. So what does this tell us? That this famine in Bethlehem seems to be localized. I think it tells us, along with I think every other famine in the promised land where God's people dwell, these only come during this time in judgment. Remember, this is the time of the judges. Everybody's doing what is right in their own eyes. They're not doing what is right in what is God's eyes. And so for their sin, God brings onto his people in Bethlehem a famine. And so Elimelech, whose name means my God is king, he leaves the land of promise. He goes back where God is not king, across the Jordan once again, out of the promised land into the wilderness. Anybody thinking this is like a reverse Exodus move? And as soon as he gets there, he dies. Moab is not a friendly place, at least to the Israelites. If you recall, this is one of the nations that on their way out of the promised land, out of the wilderness into the promised land, they went through Moab and Midian and places like this, and they got in lots of trouble there for doing things that they should not have done, joining themselves to all kinds of immoral, idolatrous worship. Numbers, like read 20 to 30. Oh my. That was this instance. It was tempestuous for them. So why does Elimelech leave the land of promise, go back out into the wilderness, when he knows this is where God has saved them from? Well, one reason and one reason only: to find bread. He moved so that he wouldn't die. What happened? He died. He moved so his family wouldn't die. What happened? His sons died. This raises a massive question, doesn't it? Why did they die? Was it God's judgment on Elimelech for making a wicked choice? Well, if you read your study notes and your study Bibles, you're going to find multiple opinions on this. Even within our congregation, I think you'll find multiple opinions on this, but for better or worse, I'm going to give you mine, and I think I'm the correct one. I mean, I wouldn't tell you if I didn't think it was the correct option. The text doesn't tell us explicitly why they died. It just says Elimelech and his sons died in Moab, leaving Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth to fend for themselves. But we were told that this all occurred in the days of the judges, when people did what was right in their own eyes. So Elimelech, we can interpret, is doing what is right in his own eyes. He makes what, according to him, is a very practical and sensible choice in trying to feed his family, but in doing so, he leaves the promised land. His very name is My God is King. My God is King leaves the land where God is King and goes back into the wilderness where they wandered for those 40 years. I think because of this, the very text itself is inviting us implicitly to conclude that Elimelech had no business leaving Bethlehem. That his sons, after their dad died, had no business staying in Moab, but should have gone back to Bethlehem. And even more so, they were forbidden in the law of Moses from taking foreign wives. And they did. What's the result? Elimelech dies, his sons die. It seems to me to be fairly clear that this is the judgment of God on this family for making what seems on the surface a very practical and sensible choice. But they were only doing what was right in their own eyes. Matthew Henry, in his commentary, goes further, and he says this: what reason had Elimelech to leave this country more than any of his neighbors? He should have been willing to take his lot and set an example to others. It is evidence of his discontented, distrustful, and unstable spirit that he was weary in the place God has set him, and to leave it immediately whenever he met with any uneasiness or inconvenience. So, church, you make choices, do you not? Some choices seem very practical and sensible, and others do not. As sensible and practical as this seemed to him, Elimelech made a wicked choice in choosing to go out from the promised land back into the wilderness, doing a reverse Exodus move, voluntary exile. As Matthew Henry said, this is our lesson. We must not grow weary in the place God has put us if we encounter in that place discomfort, inconvenience, and uneasiness. I almost want to add to Henry's commentary and there say, is there any place here where we will ever not encounter discomfort, uneasiness, and inconvenience? It's everywhere. You stay somewhere long enough, you're going to come smack right into it. And I think Elimelech shows us an unwillingness to stay where God had placed him, to trust that God really would be king over him and his family. Well, what about the women? What did they do? in this predicament. That brings us to our second heading, verse 6 to 18, coming home. Listen to these verses. Then she, that's Naomi, verse 6, arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. For it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. We'll stop right there for now. In her despair, Naomi hears something while they're in the fields of Moab, that God has visited his people and that the house of bread, Bethlehem, has bread again. This means the famine is over, judgment is ceased, and God's people are being provided for by God again. So she hears this, she makes a choice, right? Choices are made to return home. And so off she goes. Orpah and Ruth, they follow her. But along the way, Naomi turns and pleads with them to return home, and she gives 2 very logical reasons, one a little bit more potent than the other, for why they should not follow her. First, this is the logical one, they are young and she is old. If they choose to go with her, they're basically signing in to have the same lot that Naomi is experiencing. She doesn't have sons. Would they wait even if she could have a husband that very night and be pregnant with a son? Would they wait until that son is marrying age? Of course not. So she says, go home. If you go home back to Moab, you can move back in with your families. You can meet someone else. You can have sons, have daughters, have a home, have food. If you come with me, you get none of that. Go home. Well, when it says that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law there in, what verse is that? Is that 14? Yes. That's to indicate that she kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and went back to Moab. While it says that Ruth clung to her. So this is the first reason. Secondly, Naomi tells them that the hand of the Lord has gone out against her, that she's cursed by God in a sense, and because of this, they should stay away from her. Do they want to end up hungry, homeless widows too? Do they want to end up like her? Well, both of them weep. Again, Orpah leaves, Ruth stays. It's easy to see that Naomi's in quite a predicament, despairing of her situation at the end of her rope, whatever language we want to put there. It's very bleak. But she looks at what has happened to her and concludes all kinds of things. That God hates her, that God has cursed her, that God is against her. But if you know the rest of the story in these 4 chapters, you know that that's not true. Like we said at the beginning, God here is up to literally a million things, and Naomi is aware of likely none of them. all she can see right now is pain. Well, after Orpah leaves, Naomi continues her pleading with Ruth. In verse 15, she says this, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods." Curious. "Return after your sister-in-law." In verse 16, we hear Ruth speaking for the first time in the book that bears her name, words that are tremendous. In verse 16 to 18. "Do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. This is tremendous language here. I'm sure many of you have been at weddings where this language has been used. Your stuff, my stuff, your being, my being. That should come first. Your lot, my lot, your death, my death. This is very covenantal language. Why does Ruth use this language? Well, this is how God has always spoken to his people from beginning to the end of the Bible. God uses language like, "I will establish my covenant with you and your descendants, and I will be your God. I take you as my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord, and I will never leave you nor forsake you." But how can Ruth use such language? She's a Moabite. She didn't grow up in Israel. She didn't grow up learning these stories about how God had always dealt faithfully with his people. Well, she did for a time live in Naomi's household. She's still with Naomi. And I think that we see here evidence that Elimelech, perhaps, but Naomi probably taught her of the God of Israel. And so I think this language in verse 16 to 18 from Ruth not only tells us that Ruth is eager to follow Naomi, Ruth is eager to know and follow the God of Naomi as well. So I chalk this up to be a conversion moment for Ruth. She's now become a God follower. And she expresses her devotion here. That should be strange to us, right? I mean, think about what just happened. The only Israelite that Ruth really knows well is a bitter, homeless, hungry widow. If any of you know people like that, you're probably not going to enjoy a lot of chats you have with them. You're definitely probably not going to want to jump in your lot with their lot and bind yourself to this person so much so that you want to believe the same things they believe. All Ruth knows about this God of Israel is what Naomi has told her. And yet, she signs up, embracing a hard life with Naomi, but embracing a faithful God as well. And for us reading this, I mean, just imagine reading this the first time. Why would you do this? This does not seem very sensible or practical. This seems like you're signing up for everything that you don't want to happen in life. You're not going to receive much benefit from entering into this kind of covenant. Don't do this. But as we saw earlier, Elimelech made the practical, sensible decision to take his family out into exile, and he died. That was very practical and sensible, though, right? Ruth, the pagan Moabite, her name doesn't mean my God is king. She chooses to go into the promised land and sign up to have a very hard life, but she's with the true God. This looks practical and sensible. This looks foolish to the world. Yet which one's the godly option and which one's the wicked one? Such is the way of the kingdom. And that's what we see here. But if we have read Ruth, we know that the man's man is coming. His very name means strength, Boaz. You got to love his name. We're going to meet him in the next chapter. And he will, in time, as he works some things out and pulls the strings according to his intentions that are wonderful, he's going to provide everything Ruth could ever need and Naomi. She does not know Boaz exists, Ruth doesn't. And she makes this bond regardless. What a wonderful story that we are in. Elimelech, the Israelite, took his life into his own hands, leaving the promised land. Ruth, the Moabite, puts her life into God's hands and goes into the promised land. It's unexpected. It's ironic. Only God writes stories like this. There's so much to learn from Ruth here. I think she had a faith, though young, in God that knew that there's more to this God than what Naomi's life seems to show me. More to this God than even what Naomi seems to know right now in all of her pain and suffering. And I want to jump in to that God. I think Ruth knew this. Do you? Do you know this? I mean, we're winding down 2022. It's high time to reflect on the year that has passed. Are you in a similar position to where you're bitter, like Naomi, suffering in agony and pain over things that have happened to you this past year? Or are you like Ruth, experiencing the same hunger and homelessness and suffering and pain, but you see in the darkness a light that cannot be covered because God is there? Do you know this? I really want you to know this. If you don't know this, I really hope and pray that our time together this Advent in Ruth will teach you this. John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, knew this. He had a close friend who suffered a great deal in life. He suffered so much so, he tried to commit suicide multiple times. He was a hair away from being in what we would call today a mental institution, padded room, vest. His name's William Cooper. One day, John Newton, this was the kind of friend that he was. He just went into William's house and started reading his journal. Those aren't private thoughts or anything. It's fine. All right. It's totally how the story went. I'm not embellishing that at all. Just kidding. Newton was surprised and astonished to read this sentence in William Cooper's journal after knowing how much Cooper had suffered in life. He found this sentence: "Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face." Judge not the Lord by a feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. For behind a frowning providence, God hides a smiling face. That sounds like it comes from the pen of one of the most astute, scholarly theologians, pastors we could ever know in history. Yet this was a guy a hair away from the loony bin. And he knew this. Again, such is the way of the kingdom. He knew this. May you know this and love this about God. Well, now that it's just these two, Naomi and Ruth, what happened? Brings us to our third heading, at home. They've left home, come home. Now they're at home. Verse 19 to 22. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. I think a modern translation would be, Twitter went nuts in Bethlehem. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, notice how we're not supposed to forget this. Every time in this book when we hear of Ruth, she will be Ruth the Moabitess, except when Boaz is talking to her. There, she's just Ruth. That's beautiful. Naomi returned, verse 22, and Ruth the Moabite and her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, again, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Well, it had been over 10 years since they'd seen Naomi. She had left, and now she is back. It looks different, and she is not the same. Suffering does this to people. It changes them. And Naomi is certainly not the same woman that she was when she left. People started calling her, "Is that Naomi?" And she said, "Don't call me that." Naomi means pleasant in Hebrew. Mara means bitter. It's a name with history. Mara was the place where the bitter water came out for Israel. It's very well known within God's people. And she said, "Because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me, I went out full, and the Lord brought me back empty, with nothing." What do we make of these words? I think two things at least we make of them. On the one hand, can you imagine what Ruth thought about these words? You're empty? Am I nothing to you? That had to hurt, I'm sure. Ruth did not enjoy hearing Naomi say, "I once was full, but now I'm empty. God has dealt bitterly with me." And you're like, "Hello, I've not left." But I think as many of us have seen, when people are in great pain and suffering, rationality does not really factor into the equation, does it? And suffering does this to people, especially if it's really great. You see nothing else than your own issues. Maybe you're even like this. You're just not seeing anything around you as you ought to. Well, secondly, on the other hand, rather than how Ruth thinks about this, I want to ask the question, what do you make of Naomi's theology here in her comments? The Lord has dealt bitterly with me. Specifically, the Almighty, verse 21, has brought calamity upon me. Do you agree with her? I do. I think she's speaking the truth here. How can I say this? Because God is sovereign. There are no accidents. There are no coincidences. There is nothing that happens by happenstance in the world. God is never surprised. He never says, oops. He is never caught off guard. He is never unaware of what is happening or at a lack or deficiency that he would learn something he did not already know. This is what it means for God to be sovereign. And Naomi is understanding she left the land of promise. Elimelech made a bad choice and was judged by God for it. And therefore, because she had to go along with her husband, she is dealt with a hard blow. and the Almighty has brought calamity on them. I think she's right about that. But you know what I think she forgot? She forgot that God is good. Yes, He's sovereign in all of things. Jonathan Edwards said, I love to ascribe to God beyond everything absolute sovereignty. But He is good. He is also good. So all of this sovereignty, all of this allowing and ordaining and permitting, everything whatsoever happens in the world to us, all of the sovereignty that is intended and brought upon God's people is brought upon us for our good and His glory. Naomi knows this side, but she seems to forget this side. Do you? It is very difficult in the midst of pain and suffering to affirm both of these things. But you need to affirm it. Now, perhaps you're not in suffering right now and things are going relatively well. You need to learn it now so that when you enter into the suffering, these things are your anchors. Or perhaps you're in it now and you need to learn, these are my anchors. And regardless how the world, the flesh, and the devil pulls on me, I'm not going anywhere because God's sovereign good grip on me is stronger than my grip on Him. And He always leads and loves us well. We know this from the rest of the book of Ruth. Ruth will meet Boaz in time. He will provide for them. He will care for them. He will marry Ruth. They will have a baby, and in this baby, we see the road to the Messiah being paved further still. Let me explain. If there had been no famine, Elimelech would not have moved out of the land of promise to Moab. If they hadn't gone to Moab, Ruth would not be in the picture. If Ruth is not in the picture, she would have never married Boaz. If she didn't marry Boaz, they would not have had a child named Obed. If there's no Obed, there's no Jesse. If there's no Jesse, there's no David. If there's no David, there's no son of David, who's also David's God and Lord, Jesus the Messiah. So you see, in the midst of all these things, when suffering is going on, God is doing a million things, and His people might be aware of none of it. And He's working to pave the way to get to the Christmas morning moment. Things that will utterly change the fabric of history is at stake here. And God is sovereign and good over it all, wielding every heart and every minute of all of history to arrive at the destination He desires it to be. Naomi doesn't know these things, though. She's just angry. And maybe you are too. And that's okay. Anger's not a sin. Do you know that? Rage monster is. Paul says, in your anger, do not sin. So I think we must be patient with ourselves. That's okay to say. I think it's okay to say. When we're in the midst of a great deal of suffering, perhaps a Naomi-like situation, we need to be patient with ourselves because our sin is going to cause us to say things that are probably not helpful. Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. You need to be patient with yourself when you hear words coming out of your mouth like this. You need to repent of them, but you need to show yourself some grace. But I think we also, like Ruth is tested with here, need to be patient with those around us who are in situations like this as well. Ruth could be could choose to be very offended that her tremendous words in verse 16 to 18 are met with nothing but silence from Naomi. Did you catch that? She makes words that are of like covenantal history, literally like a deep heart binding to another heart, and Naomi just responds with, "That's the best she can do?" She could choose to be immensely offended. If she was probably alive today, she probably would have. Everyone loves this now, being offended. But she knows, or perhaps she needs to learn to know, that this is more about Naomi than it is about her. It's about her suffering, so she must be patient with Naomi as well. But we also are reminded, as we've said many times, God's up to so much more than we know. And we'll see that in weeks to come. Well, chapter 1 ends on a note of hope. Did you see that in verse 22 as it ended? And they came to Bethlehem, the house of bread, at the beginning of the barley harvest. The house of bread has bread once again. And so now the stage is set for Ruth. We'll see her sent out next chapter, and she will meet the man himself, Boaz. Stay tuned for the rest of the story. Come back next week as we continue on.